The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon when Mrs. Jenkins first saw him. A new face in the neighborhood. The man looked like he could have been anyone's son or brother. Tall, with a slight build, and an easy smile that made people trust him. He wore faded jeans and a gray t-shirt that bore no noticeable stains. His weathered tool belt looked almost like a badge of honor. He had an air of quiet professionalism, like he'd spent a lifetime fixing things. His name was Thomas Griffiths, and he'd been going door to door offering his services for free, no strings attached. "I'm just here to help," he said in his soft, unassuming voice when Mrs. Jenkins opened her door. "I've got a lot of experience fixing things around the house, and I thought I'd offer a helping hand to the people in the neighborhood." Mrs. Jenkins, a widow who had lived in the neighborhood for years, was skeptical. People didn't offer things for free, especially not a handyman. She had grown up in a world where the idea of helping always came with an ulterior motive. But something about Thomas's demeanor put her at ease. His friendly tone and steady gaze made her think he was genuinely just a man trying to do some good. So, despite her reservations, she invited him inside. Thomas worked fast, fixing a broken door latch, tightening loose screws, and even repairing the leaking faucet in her kitchen. He moved through her home with an unsettling calmness, like he had been here 1,000 times before, though Mrs. Jenkins had never seen him around. "Just wanted to make sure everything is in order for you," he said as he packed away his tools, his smile still present, almost too wide. "If you ever need anything else, don't hesitate to call. I'm just down the block." And just like that, he was gone, leaving Mrs. Jenkins with a house that seemed a little brighter, a little more secure, and a growing unease in her gut. Over the next few days, Thomas went from house to house, offering his services to everyone in the neighborhood. He fixed leaks, mended broken fences, and even installed new light bulbs in the elderly neighbors' homes. There was nothing remarkable about any of it, except the fact that no one had ever asked him to do any of these things. And when his work was done, he refused payment. "Just helping out," he'd say, flashing a signature smile. It wasn't long before people started talking. Some of the younger, more suspicious residents wondered if Thomas was simply doing this to gain trust so he could rob them later. But as days passed, nothing went missing. No one ever felt unsafe in their homes, even after he left. His goodwill seemed genuine, and more people began relying on him for odd jobs. But not everyone felt comfortable with Thomas's constant presence. Lena, who lived 2 houses down from Mrs. Jenkins, began to notice strange things. She had just returned from a trip to visit her sister when she saw Thomas walking out of her neighbor's house, a young couple named the Palmers. His hands were covered in grime, his face expressionless. He barely acknowledged Lena when she waved to him as she pulled into her driveway. That's when she first felt it, something cold, something that hadn't been there before. The Palmers were a quiet couple, never the type to call for help. Why had they suddenly needed a handyman? Curious, Lena began to pay closer attention. She watched as Thomas worked on the homes of the elderly couple on the corner, fixing their back gate, and then the following day, helping Mrs. Jenkins with her garden. Yet, whenever she drove past Thomas's house, she noticed that his windows were always drawn. No one ever came or went. The place had the eerie stillness of a house that no one really lived in, though she had seen Thomas there more than once. One evening, she decided to follow him. She waited until after dinner, and with her headlights dimmed, she trailed him from her driveway. The road was quiet, the air cool and crisp with the promise of a late-night chill. He walked with his usual measured pace, never speeding up or looking back. He turned into his driveway and disappeared behind the high wooden fence that surrounded his property. Lena parked a few houses down and waited. Her heart beat a little faster as she stared at the dark outline of his house. It was then that she heard it, the faintest sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor inside Thomas's house. Her skin crawled. Was someone in there? Lena had never seen anyone else at his house, but then again, no one had ever seen any family or friends visiting him. Just Thomas, alone in his house, offering help to everyone else. Her mind raced. What was going on behind those walls? Why did he refuse to let anyone inside? The following day, she decided to go to his house to ask him about it directly. She arrived mid-morning, just as he was washing his truck in the driveway. Thomas, she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. I wanted to ask you something. It's a little strange, but I've been wondering, is everything okay with your house? I noticed it seems, well, a little isolated. Thomas looked up, and his smile softened, almost pityingly. Everything's fine, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. I just like my privacy. You know how it is. Sometimes people need a little solitude to get things done. Lena nodded, but something about his response didn't sit right. The smile, the tone, it was almost too rehearsed. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, the sound of dragging something heavy echoing in her mind. There was something about Thomas that didn't add up. The next morning, she gathered her courage and returned to his house. The fence was slightly ajar. Lena knew it was risky, but something inside her urged her to step inside. She moved carefully, peeking through the gaps between the wooden slats, and that's when she saw it. A door beneath the porch, half hidden in the shadows. It wasn't just any door. It was a solid, reinforced steel door with a lock she hadn't noticed before. Her heart skipped a beat. Suddenly, she heard a faint whimper from below, followed by the unmistakable sound of chains scraping against the ground. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she backed away slowly, her mind reeling. That night, she didn't sleep. She didn't leave her house. Instead, she waited for a phone call, one that would never come. Because Thomas Griffiths wasn't a handyman. He wasn't someone looking to help the neighborhood. He was a predator, a quiet torturer who had carefully built his little empire. His basement, soundproofed and dark, contained those unlucky few who had begun to question him. The ones who saw through the kindness to the horror hiding beneath. And now Lena knew too much. The sound of dragging chains grew louder in her mind. She could only pray it wasn't her turn next.